Hey everyone, Nick Yuskevich back again with another episode of Tee to Green brought to you by Daily Fantasy Winners. And this week it is one of the most exciting tournaments of the year in the U.S. Open. It is a tournament that is being played in Hartford, Wisconsin this year at a golf course called Erin Hills. It's the first time this venue has ever been used, not only at the U.S. Open, not only at a major championship. It is the first time this venue has been used at a PGA Tour tournament. So it's going to be new to the players, new to the media, new to the fans. It's going to be new to the daily fantasy community. It's going to be new to everybody. And so I think it's going to be a lot of fun, actually, this week. I think this golf course sets up perfectly for everybody involved, actually, whether you're daily fantasy, whether you're just a golf fan watching on TV, or, you know, the players and everything like that. I think it's going to be one of the best U.S. Opens of the year, and not just saying that to build up the excitement, saying it because I actually believe it. And so let's see here. Let's just dive into a couple basic things about the U.S. Open for some of the newer players to daily fantasy golf. And then I'm going to spend a vast majority of the time in this video about the golf course itself because, like I said, Erin Hills is the first time this course has ever been used, so we don't have really any course data or tournament data to go off of, other than, you know, obviously looking at yardages and things like that, but and, you know, looking at, you know, videos and pictures and all that in reports. But that's all we have to go off of, other versus the actual tournament data history. And then, you know, I'll obviously dive into the strategy a little bit, and then we'll get into the picks, and I'll actually elaborate on the picks a little bit. So this is going to probably be a little bit of a longer edition of Tee to Green this week, which I don't think you guys will complain about too much. And so hopefully my voice makes it through this whole thing. And so let's just get right on into it then. So the U.S. Open, this is a major championship, of course. This is the second of 4 major championships that are played every year. The Masters was the first one. U.S. Open is this one. Open Championship, middle of July, and then the PGA Championship in the middle of August. And so what's unique about the U.S. Open, this is a tournament that's ran by the United States Golf Association and USGA. And the only reason why I'm bringing this up, and there's no need to get into the I guess let's just say unnecessary details here. But the USGA likes to make the golf course extremely difficult. They like to make it very fair, according to them, but they also like to make it a very tough test as well. And this is often one of the toughest, if not the toughest, scoring weeks of the year. Sometimes the winning score will be even as many as or as little as many or as little, I don't know. As it'll be a few strokes over par will be the winning score. Sometimes it'll be even par. Sometimes it'll be a few strokes under par. It's usually around par, though, is where we usually see the champion. This year, I actually expect the winning score to be a few strokes under par. It's still, but even one way or the other, I do think this is going to obviously still be one of the toughest scoring weeks of the year. And so, like I said, because this is the first time Erin Hills has been used, we're going to spend a lot of time diving into the golf course. The only other thing I can really say about the U.S. Open that's really of note is just that, yeah, this is a full field. This is a traditional cut as far as because I know some people like the cut rules technically slightly change at some of the special tournaments. So I will just say this is a traditional cut. There's like 150 golfers or 152. I forget the exact number, but it's still top 70 plus ties and everything like that. There is a bottom like 15 to 20 golfers in this field or so. That's, you know, like in the lower 6K range on DraftKings or in the 4K range on FanDuel, who are like amateur players or the very bottom end of the PGA Tour that kind of like snuck into this event or just qualified in kind of like maybe like a bizarre, weird way. It's just that there are guys that are very unlikely going to make the cut, but still, this is a very, very strong field. You know, for most part, top to bottom or top to like 80% of the way down or 90%, actually more than that, like 95% of the way down or so. So a very strong field, of course, because it's a major championship. Okay, Erin Hills, let's get into the details of the golf course here. This is going to be the bulk of the video. This is a golf course that could technically tip out as much as if they wanted to. They could technically tip it out to 8,000 yards if they wanted to, but it sounds like the max that the USGA is going to tip out Erin Hills at for this tournament is 7,741 yards. It's still going to be a very long golf course. Even though they're not going to technically push it all the way to 8K, which I was kind of hoping they would, but they didn't. So 7,741 yards. There are a couple things to note, though. It won't play as long as 7,741 yards. It'll probably play somewhere between 7,600 and 7,700 each day. Why is that the case? Number one, they're going to move the tee boxes up on a few of the holes every day. The USGA loves to move tee boxes around from day to day, and not necessarily use 4 different tee boxes on every hole, but they'll move it around a little bit each and every day. on a couple of the holes, and maybe they'll use 2 different spots on a hole, and they'll use 3 different spots on another hole, or something like that. So it just depends. But they're going to move the tee boxes up a little bit on some of the holes on some of the days, and so that will shorten the course a little bit in that sense. The other thing also is the U.S. Open has almost always been at a par 70 or a par 71, at least in recent memory. The last time a par 72 was used at a U.S. Open goes back to the early 1990s, so it's been about 25 years or so since they've been at a par 72, which this is a par 72 at 7,741 yards. The other thing that also is important to note is that the way this golf course sets up with the elevation and just the way the golf course is designed, some of these holes you're going to look at and you're going to say, oh my goodness, this is like, that's a par 4 over like 500 yards, or it's a par 5 that's like 660. These golf holes are probably either playing downhill, or they often play downwind, or they're at parts that are usually firmer, and they're not in the wetter spots of the golf course that are like lower to the ground. That's something to just keep in mind. The golf course just kind of won't play quite as long as 77.41, but nevertheless, it is still a very long golf course in comparison to the average PGA Tour golf course. So for the par 5s, it is obviously they are long par 5s. They are all 600 yards or more. But again, like I said, a couple of the tee boxes will probably be moved up. Maybe a couple of them will be like 550, 560, 570, something like that, and they'll switch it up a little bit, maybe a little bit more, who knows. But for the most part, just because we have no course tournament data history to go off of here, but just by looking at the lengths of these par 5s, it doesn't take any kind of a genius of any kind to know that length is going to be important here for eagles. Yes, maybe some of the medium length hitters will still be able to record an eagle here or there on some of these par 5s when they move the tee boxes up or they play downwind, but the bombers and the longer hitters are going to be more important. The other thing I'll also say is when I say bombers or longer hitters, sometimes I think this gets... bombers, that does not mean the top 10 guys in driving distance, by the way, for some people who think like bombers just means like only Dustin Johnson, Rory McIlroy, and Jason Day. Like, no, it's more than that. You usually are looking for guys that are average driving distance, yeah. Historically, you can look at this year too, but look more historically, that are more around 300 yards or more. You could even say the upper 200s is fine, because some golfers do use 3-wood off a lot of the tee, because driving distance factors in all clubs used off the tee. Some guys will use 3-wood more, and maybe some of the tournaments they've played previously, and then they'll end up hitting driver more at this golf tournament. And so you kind of have to know golf history a little bit, or not necessarily golf history, but just be familiar with the different golfers and know what kind of games that they have. But yeah, just look, it could be guys that are ranked, like top 50 in driving distance, something like that. And even some of the medium length hitters, 60th, 70th, like those guys can sometimes rip it too as well. So just something to keep in mind. It doesn't have to be like the top 5, 10 guys in driving distance for bombers. So in any case, not only is the length going to be important on the par 5s, the length is definitely going to be important just for the entire golf course. And I say this because, there is supposed to be some rain on and off this week. And so the USGA definitely likes to make the golf course as firm as possible, certainly, and let shots roll out and everything. But, you can't control, the golf committees can't control rain, like it happens. And so the golf course could play a little bit longer and the ball won't roll out as much. The other thing also is a lot of times when you get in these longer golf courses, there won't be many obstacles right in front of the green. So sometimes some of the shorter hitters will be able to bounce shots onto the green, or any player can have the option to bounce shots onto a green. There aren't going to be many chances for that here. Number one, because the ground will probably be a little bit softer this week. The other reasons are because you have a fair amount of elevated greens with some false fronts, and you also have a fair amount of holes with bunkers protecting the fronts of the green. So there aren't going to be, there'll be a few opportunities, but there won't be many. You're going to need to fly shots onto the green and apply the appropriate spin, and obviously make sure you don't go over the green. And there'll just be a lot of long iron shots into these greens as well. So obviously, the higher lofted clubs you have coming into these greens, with the more spin you have, and the softer they land on these greens, the better. So that's just definitely another reason why length is going to be important. And I'm just going to say this right now before I forget. Yes, I'm going to be promoting length here big time in this video. There are going to be a few other things we look at, of course. Length is going to be a big thing. If you've been watching my Tee to Green videos for the last couple of years, and you've been, or just, knowing like kind of the content I do and everything, you'll know that with my advice, I usually like to give more than just like one thing or two things or everything like that. Or I usually don't just beat like one statistic into the ground. I usually like, doing a thorough job. At least I hope you guys think that. But the one thing I will say here though is, and it applies to the major championships, aspect here in a second, but there are a couple tournaments here where I will promote every year. Usually, it depends on where all the tournaments are, of course, but there are usually a tournament or two where I will really promote length, and this is one of them. And I will go back in history. If you go back and look at the content I did on the U.S. Open at Chambers Bay, and the PGA Championship, in particular, in 2015 at Whistling Straits. Those were courses where I said, just, you really want to prioritize length here pretty much over almost everything else. Not necessarily everything, but it was one of the top things. And I really said it at Whistling Straits. And I said, I don't care if I'm the only person, or I don't care if I'm not the only person saying this. Like, you don't need to get cute with this. I'll just say this. Like, I remember Whistling Straits going from Saturday night into Sunday, going into the final round. Max was tied for first going in the Millie Maker going into Sunday, and there are several other people I know that were essentially using my advice or like the picks I'd given out to people and everything like that did really well. None of them won the Millie Maker, unfortunately, but there were a lot of people in contention at both of those tournaments, especially the PGA Championship that week. And so if I'm saying length is very much a strong thing here, I definitely mean it. I'm not just trying to like spit it out because it's obvious. I really do believe it's going to be an important thing here this weekend. And I know, again, like I said, I'm not going to be the only person that says this. I know other people are going to say that's out there, and that's fine. It's just going to be an important factor here. So anyway, so back into some of the details about Erin Hills. I really wanted to make that point clear. It's going to be windy at Erin Hills this week, and that's always the case. It's not like there are basically no trees on the golf course. There are a few, but for all intents and purposes, there are no trees on the golf course and protecting the wind. So if you do look at the weather forecast right now for Erin Hills, there's rain, but we'll get into that. We'll get into that a little bit later. But as far as the wind goes, yeah, it says like at Hartford, Wisconsin, there's going to be like 5-mile-an-hour winds in the mornings and like 10, 12-mile-an-hour winds in the afternoons. Like, that sounds pretty normal. Those winds are going to be magnified a little bit just because there are no trees, like I said, protecting the golf course. And the wind gusts will be a little bit more extreme out there than they would like, in the city of Hartford, or like, in some places where you do have some more things blocking the wind gusts. And so that is a really important thing to note, that the golf ball will be exposed to a lot of wind there. And so that's definitely something to keep in mind. For the fairway width, the fairways are not that narrow by U.S. Open standards. They're not wide, but they're reasonable. I will just say that. But the thing is, if you miss the fairway, you have about like 5 yards. It depends on the hole in the spot, obviously, but a lot of times if you miss the fairway off the tee, you will have like 5 yards of rough, just like normal traditional rough, and then you'll have very long and thick fescue. If you haven't seen this, go check out Kevin Na's Instagram video. He had a nice, I don't know if you want to call it a rant. He was just showing off, I guess. He like just threw a ball in the fescue, and he essentially couldn't hit out of it. He could barely find it after he couldn't hit out of it. And so it's very long, very thick, and sometimes even unplayable. And so it's needless to say, yes, length is going to be very important, and bombers are going to be important. But it's also to note that if somebody is a really inaccurate driver of the golf ball, particularly with the driver, and they're just not hitting it well as of late over the last few weeks, that is somebody I probably would caution against a little bit. You don't want to just say driving accuracy is 100% irrelevant, but it is something. It's just something you want to keep in mind a little bit here, that you don't want somebody spraying it all over the place, because then you could certainly be in trouble. And so, what else here? Like I said earlier, there are big elevation changes on this golf course. There are some golfers, this sometimes I actually feel like always just continues to get overlooked. There are players who are better on flatter courses, or like Florida-style courses, or courses you more see in the Southeast tournaments, that are just on flatter pieces of land, essentially. There are golfers that are sometimes better on the courses that do have more elevation changes, or on like the West Coast tournaments, or some of the Midwest or East Coast tournaments that are on some higher elevation changes. And so that's something you really only can go back and look at tournament history on, and just kind of know where the golfers are popping up at which. But if you know that kind of stuff, or you want to take the time to look at it, I would recommend going to do that. There are some people that are better at certain types of courses, so you can look at that. The last thing I want to say before I get into really the strategy element of this is, A lot of people do like to go back and look for courses. Like if we have a new venue like Erin Hills. I remember when Chambers Bay came up, some people tried to do this, and we've seen this at PGA championships in the past and everything. People like to go back and look because they want to find some course data or some tournament history to go off of that's like some kind of a comparison. And that's been, obviously that makes sense and people want to do that. So for the case of this, I will just say these are 2 golf courses and 3 different golf tournaments because one of these tournaments, we use this course twice, you could go back and look at that are at least a little bit similar. They're not exactly similar, and I would take these with somewhat of a grain of salt, but I do think they're similar enough that you'll get the gist of it here. So the 2 courses I would go back and look at are Chambers Bay and Whistling Straits. Chambers Bay was the 2015 U.S. Open. Whistling Straits was the 2015 PGA and the 2010 PGA. And obviously, like I said earlier, with the length in saying that this is important here, and this is why I'm bringing up these courses now, but Chambers Bay was a very long golf course at the U.S. Open. It was like, that was about 7,700, maybe a little bit under 7,700. I forget the exact distance. But so that was definitely a course that was long, definitely a course that had some elevation changes, definitely a golf course that had very few trees, that the wind would be a little bit more exposed to the golf ball there. It was certainly, it was different in several other ways, but there are enough similarities that I think you'll find a little bit of a similarity to the type of a leaderboard we might see here. And then Whistling Straits is kind of the same concept. I know the Whistling Straits was the PGA, and the Whistling Straits is a little bit more scoreable. Whistling Straits really only gets like very difficult for the PGA players if the wind's howling out there. That's really when Whistling Straits gets difficult, and if they can make the golf course firm. But Whistling Straits saw a reasonable amount of rain, and the wind didn't blow that much at that tournament, so it didn't end up happening. Those are both golf courses that are long. The fairways were reasonable width, but if you missed the fairway, it was really bad, especially at Whistling Straits, I would say for that. And so like I said, they're a little bit similar, and you can take a look at that. Some people, I heard say Torrey Pines because at 7,600. Like, yeah, Torrey Pines is a very long golf course at 7,600, but I don't think Torrey Pines plays anything like. Other than the length, there's nothing really similar comparing Torrey Pines to Erin Hills. I would not look at Torrey Pines. You can if you want, but that's not a course I would include on this. And so, okay, so let's go on to the strategy. That pretty much covers Erin Hills. So for the strategy angle, one last thing. I'm sorry, before I get onto the course history thing, actually, I forgot one last thing. Like I said, there's been no PGA Tour tournament that's ever been played at Erin Hills, but there was, I think it was a U.S. Amateur that was played here about 5 or 6 years ago. I've heard some people mention this, and that maybe 15 to 20 of the golfers played it that are in this field have played at that U.S. Amateur. First of all, that was 5 to 6 years ago. I would say that. Now, granted, the 2010 PGA Championship was, I guess, too, when I just mentioned that. But I would more or less say this. The golf course, not only is it 5 or 6 years ago, the U.S. Amateur, even though that's also ran by the USGA, it was probably also playing at a shorter distance under easier conditions. Like, the U.S. Amateur is one of the best tournaments there is. That's, a lot of people don't watch, but I would also say that they set up the U.S. Open definitely a lot more. It's a lot more difficult. So I really just would not look back at a U.S. Amateur leaderboard. And this 5 to 6 years ago, it was one tournament. It could be misleading. I would look a little bit more at the course data, tournament data history of Chambers and Whistling Straits over the 5 or 6 years ago of the U.S. Amateur. That's just my 2 cents on that. So just for whatever that's worth. And so let's take a look at the strategy. Yeah, like I said. Okay, so statistics. Strokes gained tee to green. No doubt about it. This is definitely a tee to green golf course. Strokes gained off the tee, strokes gained approaching the green. Strokes gained off the tee is important because it factors in the length, which you need here, but you also don't want somebody that's spraying the ball all over the place, of course, as well. Strokes gained approaching the green always shows up every week, no matter what. I do think it's particularly going to show up this week because if you are driving the golf ball well, a lot of players have said this already in some interviews this week, and there have been some reports of talking to some of the players as well, that a lot of them believe if you're driving the golf ball well, it's going to be a second shot golf course. How do you handle the wind? Where do you land the ball on the green to the right spots? Certainly. It does seem like that these greens will be a little bit easier than maybe some of the past U.S. Opens, but still, it's the U.S. Open. They're not going to make the greens easy, and they're going to make the pins very difficult out there, especially if the greens are a little bit softer actually out there as well. Then they'll make the pin certainly as tough as possible, absolutely. And so strokes gained approaching the green is going to be a big thing as well along the way with strokes gained off the tee. Length is important, like I said. Length is also just going to be important as well, as there are a lot of long carries that players are going to have off the tee. Like you're going to have some holes that are going to maybe be some downhill dog legs, and the wind's going to be howling, and it's going to be important maybe for the longer hitters to carry some of the dog legs and these long carries just to get to even maybe some of the fairways. Like that's another reason why length is also going to be important here. But so length's important. The driving accuracy thing I touched on a little bit. It's not a priority, but you don't want somebody that's spraying it all over the place. And you want good win players. Now, this is one that's always tough for me to relay just in terms of because a lot of knowing who good win players are honestly just comes from daily fantasy golf history or really just knowing your golfers and knowing what kind of tournaments players do better at. But there are a few things you can look at. Number one, you can look at Apex score. And Apex will tell you like how high or how low somebody hits their ball flight on average. The only problem with that, I think, is sometimes players will naturally hit a higher ball flight, but when they get in tougher conditions, they can also be good at just lowering their ball flights, to adjust for it, and they're just effective at it. So I don't think it's the perfect, metric exactly, but I do think it's certainly something you can look at and can help you get a little bit of an indication. And the other thing I will also say, this is generally speaking, this isn't like true for everybody certainly, but generally speaking, European players and really international players, like just non-American players, are better than American players in windy conditions. And usually, the main reason I think this could be somewhat debated certainly, but I think the main reason for this is a lot of the European players when they're growing up, they're playing oftentimes year round in some tougher conditions when it comes to maybe some, it can be cooler temperatures I guess too, but really more so I'm saying it just because the conditions can be a little bit windier certainly consistently, whereas a lot of the American players, yes, they don't necessarily all grow up in the South, but a lot of the times these golfers, when they haven't been in school, they will go play in Florida. Or a lot of times, like they'll move to Florida to play golf, or it'll be in Arizona, just warmer places where, and not as windy usually a lot of the time, where they're more used to just some better conditions overall on a day-to-day basis on average. And so that's not the case with everybody, I think, but I do think that's a little bit of something you can look at as well. I think that's pretty much it as far as the strategy goes. As far as how you should balance out your salary structures, I think this is such a strong field. There are so many golfers that are capable of winning this tournament. I honestly have no advice as far as you should go high-low or you should go balanced. There's no way I'm leaning this week. I think you can go all different kinds of routes with this as far as that kind of a strategy goes. And if you're really trying to prioritize, that's just something you should be prioritizing. You should be prioritizing which golfers do you like the most as far as like the length or the recent performance and all that, or who's good win players. Maybe it'll be a certain tee time. I'll get into that in just a second. That's where your focus should be. Don't worry about, I have I have like 2 guys in the 6K range. Oh no, I have like 3 guys that are, or I have like 4 or 5 guys in the 7K range. Like I just don't worry about that. You're overthinking it in my opinion. Okay, so on to the weather. The wind will be up, like I said, especially in the afternoon, so that's just tradition. That's just normal. The one thing that's going to come into play here as far as rain goes and how it could play an impact. It's supposed to rain on and off all week. I'm recording this on a Monday afternoon, so it's obviously pretty early for weather predictions, so this far out, and especially how it applies to what will give a weather delay during a golf tournament, especially like the U.S. Open. So if the tournament plays just straight through and there's rain and it's softer, but like the tee time, there are no weather delays, then I really don't think there's going to be a tee time difference. Now maybe the wind amounts will change a little bit and there still will be, but I think it'll be okay that there won't be a huge tee time edge either way. If there's a weather delay though, at some point I do think there could be a tee time advantage. How would this be the case? Let's say, the winds are supposed to be up in the afternoons more than the mornings, and the gusts are significantly more. What could happen is you could have the guys tee off Thursday morning on golf, the first wave tee off Thursday morning and have a great tee time wave. Then the guys that are supposed to play Thursday afternoon get a bad draw, and then it's not a bad draw, but they get the worst end of it day 1. But here comes day 2, and it's raining a bunch, and then they delay it for a handful of hours. And then the guys that were supposed to tee off Friday morning then tee off Friday afternoon, and they get a double dose of the higher winds. And then the guys that were supposed to play Thursday morning Friday afternoon, end up playing Thursday morning and Saturday morning or something like that. Like that is an example of something that could happen. Again, like I said, let's look into this more later on Wednesday night. There's no point in getting too caught up in it this far out. But it is important to note that there is supposed to be rain. It could lead to some delays. And with the way this course sets up, it is a possibility that there could be a bigger tee time edge. And I know that's frustrating from you want to set your lineups a little bit farther out in advance, make sure you get them all entered before certain things lock and everything, and everybody has their own way of doing it. But again, if you want to do this the right way, you want to enter a dummy lineup and just make sure you enter, or enter a lineup that you think will be good, but just note that you may need to edit it, or it depends on if you're making one lineup or 150. I know that, but I would just recommend making sure you don't actually finalize your lineups again until at the minimum Wednesday evening to double check on the weather. Whew, okay, losing my breath here a little bit. I'll try and slow down here slightly. I know I was speeding up there. All right, on to the picks. I'm going to expand a little bit on the picks this week. Usually I just do one or two golfers in the 10 plus K range and then one or two golfers below 10K. I'm going to expand a little bit this week. I will talk about all the guys that are 9K and above, and I'll break it down by 10K and up, and then the 9K range as well. And I'll just kind of break it down to two little sections here. So for section one, we have 6 golfers here that are above 10K on DraftKings, and there's only 5 of them are above 10K on FanDuel, but I'm just going to throw these 6 guys into one clump here. So in this 10K or above section, there are 2 tiers of golfers in my mind. The tier 1 guys are Dustin Johnson, Jason Day, and Jon Rahm. The tier 2 guys are Rory McIlroy, Jordan Spieth, and Ricky Fowler. For cash formats, I would go with Dustin, Jason, or John. DJ, Day, or Rahm, I should just say. Call by their last names to be. Those are common first names. And then for McIlroy, Spieth, and Fowler, I do think that they are more just GPP guys. I think they're all definitely in play for GPPs, undoubtedly. But so for Johnson, Day, and Rahm, starting with DJ, 12K on DraftKings, 11.2 on FanDuel. Definitely should be the favorite. Don't deny that at all. I am not worried about his miscut or Jon Rahm's miscut at the Memorial. If you remember my video from the Memorial, I said that golf course really doesn't promote length, and so not that, like I said, they're 2 of the best golfers, and I say you should use them. But I was saying it's also they don't have a huge edge on a golf course like that. Turns out they just missed the cut, and I was shocked by that, to be fair. But at the same time, though, I'm not worried about the missed cuts from either of those guys. So DJ, 12K on DraftKings, 11.2K on FanDuel. You could use him in cash because it's a deep enough field, but I would probably say he's a little bit better in GPP just because you can save a little bit more for Jason Day or Jon Rahm in cash. That's probably where I would go with it. But, DJ in cash, I won't argue it. For those of you that are seeing the reports about Dustin expecting a second child with Paulina, yes, they are. So Dustin and Paulina are expecting the second child anytime Monday night or Tuesday morning. Last I saw. And so, so Dustin's won't be playing Erin Hills as much leading into the tournament. Having said that, he was at Erin Hills last week, like the week of the Tennessee tournament, and that's probably actually a big reason why he skipped the FedEx St. Jude Classic tournament he usually plays in. Probably skipped that to go get his practice rounds in at Erin Hills because he was expecting his second child with Paulina, and then so he wouldn't get as much practice rounds, and then plus it's a golf course that's new to everybody, so like it's very understandable why Dustin skipped St. Jude, certainly when you factor in all the variables, and certainly. And so in any case, so Dustin got some practice rounds in last week. I think he's a great fit for this golf course. Obviously, is the length. He can hit a lower ball flight. He's just awesome tee to green, and on courses that promote length, that's where you want to use Dustin. Dustin Johnson and Jason Day, for that matter, who I'll talk about next, they both have outstanding U.S. Open history. I only bring this up because the U.S. Open usually is one of the toughest tests every year consistently. I know the golf course venue changes every year, but at the same time, some golfers really do handle sometimes I call it variance, sometimes I just call it the really tough conditions. Sometimes they're even unfair a little bit. I don't want to say unfair. I don't like using unfair. Well, sometimes it is, but the U.S. Open just likes making an extremely difficult test. And Jason Day and Dustin Johnson have both been very good over time and at handling that. And so Something to know for that. And they're also both fantastic players on courses with elevation changes, certainly. And so if you take a look at the history of like the Chambers Bay and Whistling Straits, Dustin and Jason Day have both played fantastically in those venues. And so that's it for Dustin. So on to Jason Day for all the same reasons I just mentioned. Also, I would just say, as I've kind of said all year, I don't think Jason Day is as in bad as form as people realize. You're starting to see Jason Day's form be a little bit better as far as the results on the scoreboard, just because, or on the leaderboard, just because his strokes gained putting is now finally getting the positive regression we were all expecting. The strokes gained approaching the green still isn't quite as sharp as you'd want to see it, but it is getting better. And so Jason Day is really getting close here, and this is a perfect venue, and I think a perfect time actually for him to. I think this is a really good week, definitely to pick him to win, and so he would definitely be one of my top golfer recommendations. And then Jon Rahm as well. Obviously, 10.3K on DraftKings, 10.4K on FanDuel. Somebody obviously who's just off the charts, awesome tee to green, can bomb it, a little bit of a lower ball flight, certainly. And then, it's kind of funny. I know Jon Rahm's been always the funny one here for me this year, just because I was like, I was kind of saying, people might want to slow their expectations down a little bit. And then, of course, Jon Rahm just continues to do very well. And I just said, all right, fine. Like, yeah, maybe he really just is that good. Jon Rahm's having one of the best rookie seasons I've ever seen. And then, of course, he misses the cut of the Memorial, kind of when I'm starting to come around to it. But nevertheless, this is a great course fit for Jon Rahm. He's one of the top choices. He absolutely is. I'm not going to be stubborn about it. So Jon Rahm is definitely up there as one of the top choices. And so as far as the second tier guys of the 10K plus guys, we're looking at Rory, Spieth, and Fowler. Rory would be in the top tier guys to me. But it's just because of the back issue. That's really the only reason, and he's just hasn't been playing very much. He has played 45 holes at Erin Hills. He has been playing over the weekend at Erin Hills and getting in some good work as far as like knowing the golf course and everything. But as far as like but as far as like actual tournament reps and really practicing a lot, he hasn't done much. So that's the only reason why he's in tier 2 or the second tier in my mind for these expensive golfers. And like I said, GPPs, but definitely wouldn't use them in cash. Spieth and Fowler, I would say GPPs probably a little bit would be better than cash formats. Certainly, just because all three of these guys, and McIlroy, Spieth, and Fowler, all I just think have a little bit of a greater chance of missing the cut, which is why I say more for GPPs. Spieth and Fowler, they're both good as far as like they're both really good putters. They're both great as far as strokes gained approaching the green. Fowler's a little bit better strokes gained off the tee, certainly, than Jordan Spieth is, and Fowler's will have a little bit more length. But having said that, I think Jordan Spieth is a little bit better on a golf course like this, where there's more elevation changes. Fowler's shown a little bit better course history or tournament history as far as the Florida golf courses and usually the flatter courses. I don't know why. Fowler lives in Jupiter, Florida. Maybe there's something there to that. But Spieth's been a little bit better on the courses with elevation changes. So some slight pros and cons to both Spieth and Fowler, kind of nitpicking at them a little bit. But I think they're both very good and about equal. You are getting good value on FanDuel in particular with Spieth and Fowler, I will say, just because Day, Rahm are both about the same price on DraftKings and FanDuel, whereas Spieth and Fowler, Spieth, you're looking at 11.5 on DraftKings and 10.1 on FanDuel, so in a 1.4K differential, and then you're looking at a 1.3K differential with Fowler and 10.5K on DraftKings and 9.2K on FanDuel. So on to the golfers that are under 10K, and I'm going to say 8.8K to 10K on DraftKings is going to be the range I talk about here. There are 5 golfers, and I'm expanding it to 8.8K just because Adam Scott really is as good as these guys. That's why I'm extending it a little bit. There are 4 guys kind of in my tier 1 and 1 guy in my tier 2 as far as my recommendations this week. The tier 1 is Justin Rose, Adam Scott, Hideki Matsuyama, and Brooks Koepka. That's probably the order I would do it in if I had to. I'm nitpicking incredibly of those 4 guys, but that's probably the order I would do it in terms of the guys I like the most. And then in tier 2 would be Henrik Stenson. The reason why Henrik Stenson, I'll just get him out of the way here, for tier 2 is the form. First of all, the course fit is not my favorite for him, but more importantly, also combined with that, the recent form it's definitely better than where it was, but it's still not that great in my mind. And if somebody's not going to have the greatest recent form coming into an event, I want to see that he has a really good course fit, and this just really isn't a course fit for him. That's kind of just the basic thing is here's for Stenson. look, he could still play very well. I'm not saying to fade him in GPPs. And just if you're somebody that's maxing out like 150 lineups, or maybe you're only doing like 100 lineups, you're just making several lineups. I would never fade anybody 9K or above on DraftKings or 9K or above on FanDuel. If you get into the 8K range, maybe there's like one or two guys pending the tournament. But but for this tournament, even on DraftKings, I wouldn't even fade anybody in the 8K range. Maybe one or two guys. I mean, I'm going to dive into the cheaper guys a little bit more throughout the week, and I'll have the usual list up on DailyFantasyWinners.com, of course. But yeah, I just, for the most part, you just don't have to worry about fading guys. I just wouldn't do that. I'm all about differentiating and just, obviously having higher ownerships at the appropriate spots, especially for the more expensive guys. I'm much more about differentiation and not putting all your eggs into one basket, essentially. So let's see here. So yeah, Justin Rose, Adam Scott, Hideki Matsuyama, Brooks Koepka. Those are the four guys. I could get into all four of these guys specifically, I guess, really quick. Justin Rose and Adam Scott and Hideki Matsuyama are all kind of for the same reason. They're all in one way or another, all in pretty good form. They're all longer hitters. They're all really good tee to green players. You could tweak it a little. You could nitpick a little bit and say, this guy's a little bit better than this, and this guy's a little bit better than that. But I think they're all about the same. I don't really have one that I would really like above anyone else. As far as that, obviously, Adam Scott's the cheapest of the bunch as far as DraftKings goes. He's 8.8K on DraftKings. He's 9.5K on FanDuel. So that's usually the average price differential between DraftKings and FanDuel. For the expensive guys, it's not as much, but usually someone on DraftKings should be a little bit more expensive than FanDuel on average. And so since it's the other way around for Scott, you're definitely getting better value on Scott on DraftKings. And I'm sure the ownerships will reflect that a little bit too, of course. But and then Brooks Koepka, the form isn't quite as good, but I will say this. Koepka is played really well in U.S. Opens. He is somebody that's obviously very much a bomber and plays very much better on courses that promote length. So this is actually a really good fit for Brooks Koepka. And at 9K on DraftKings, I think 8.4K on FanDuel, he'll probably get used a little bit more. But on DraftKings at 9K, I'm not going to say he'll slip through the cracks, but I do think his ownership won't be as high as you might expect. And I think you can get some good value on Koepka in particular on DraftKings, even though he's a little bit more expensive on DraftKings. And so that is it for this video. Thank you for bearing with me on this lengthy video. Hopefully you got a lot of good details out of this. I might be back for another video, Tee to Green, actually this week. I don't want to promise it, but I'm pretty sure we're going to have it. It will be similar to what Max and I did for the Players' Championship. I'll see if we can get him on here, and we'll see if we can hammer out a few of our favorite picks. Some guys that obviously he likes, of course, and then maybe some guys I like that I didn't mention in this video, or maybe I'll dive in deeper to one or two guys that I did mention. So it'll be similar to that. And obviously, of course, Max loves talking about the putting regression tool, which I definitely love as well. And I didn't even get into mentioning the putting regression tool here on this video. Definitely use that as well, of course, this week in making your picks as far as the putting regression goes. So in any case, thank you for watching. You can follow me at Nick Yuskevich on Twitter. Now that the Penguins have won the Stanley Cup, I'll stop tweeting about the Penguins, so it'll be definitely be a lot more golf tweets coming up. But Daily Fantasy Winners is, of course, on Twitter at DFantasyWinners, and then please remember to like and subscribe to our YouTube videos and our YouTube channel. I very much appreciate that. All right, thanks everyone, and good luck.